The heavy wooden floorboards of the farmhouse groaned under the weight of the Union soldiers, a sound that seemed deafening in the silence of the Tennessee twilight. Outside, the distant rumble of artillery fire echoed off the Smoky Mountains, a constant reminder that the Confederate line was collapsing inward, pushing desperate gray-clad battalions right into their path. Inside the dusty parlor, the air was thick with the smell of stale sweat, gun oil, and the dry, herbal scent of dried tobacco hanging from the rafters. In the center of the room sat Ilara, a woman whose eyes were clouded over with the milky haze of cataracts, her hands resting calmly on the head of a cane that looked as brittle as her own bones. She had sheltered the 6 men of Captain Elias Thorne's squad for 3 weeks, feeding them from her meager winter stores while enemy patrols scourged the valley. Captain Thorne stood by the window, peering through a crack in the shutter, his knuckles white as he gripped the sill. He watched the tree line where the shadows were lengthening and seemingly moving with malicious intent. His uniform was tattered, the blue wool stained with mud and dried blood, but his posture remained rigid, a habit of discipline that the war had failed to beat out of him. Behind him, his second-in-command, Sergeant Miller, was hurriedly packing a rucksack, his movements jerky and agitated. The squad was preparing to leave. The intelligence they had gathered was vital, and the approaching Confederate regiment made their position untenable. They had to move now, under the cover of the deepening dusk, or risk being encircled and hanged as spies. "We leave in 5 minutes," Thorne said, his voice a low rasp that barely carried across the room. He turned to look at the old woman, a pang of sharp guilt piercing through his exhaustion. Ilara did not move, though her head tilted slightly, tracking the sound of his voice with the uncanny precision of the blind. She knew they were leaving. She had known it from the moment the wind changed direction earlier that afternoon, carrying the scent of wood smoke and unwashed horses from the south. She did not ask to go with them. She knew she would only slow them down in the rugged terrain they had to cross, and in this war, speed was the only currency that bought survival. "What about her, Cap?" Private Higgins whispered, glancing nervously at the door. "If the Rebs find her here, if they find out she harbored blue bellies." He let the sentence trail off, the implication hanging heavy in the stagnant air. The Confederates operating in this sector were irregulars, bushwhackers who operated outside the bounds of military conduct. They burned first and asked questions later. To leave Ilara behind was effectively a death sentence, or at the very least, a condemnation to homelessness in a freezing winter. Thorne looked at Miller, waiting for a suggestion, a plan, anything that could salvage their conscience. Miller didn't look up from his pack. "She's dead weight, Captain," the sergeant said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion, though his hands shook slightly as he buckled a strap. "We can't carry her over the ridge. We can't hide her. If we try, we all die, and the intel dies with us. She stays." It was the brutal arithmetic of war, the cold calculation that traded one life for the potential salvation of hundreds. Thorne hated it. He hated Miller for saying it, but he hated himself more for knowing it was true. Thorne walked over to Ilara, kneeling beside her chair so that he was eye-level with her unseeing gaze. He took one of her withered hands in his. It felt like dry parchment wrapped around fragile twigs. "We have to go, Ilara," he said softly. "The enemy is less than a mile out. You need to hide in the root cellar. Stay quiet. Do not come out until the shooting stops." It was a feeble instruction, a useless comfort. If the bushwhackers burned the house, the root cellar would become an oven. Ilara squeezed his hand with surprising strength. "Go, Captain," she whispered, her voice cracking like dry leaves. "I was old before this war began, and I will be here when it ends, one way or another. You have your duty." She released him and placed her hands back on her cane, resuming her vigil of silence. She offered no absolution, no tearful farewell. She simply accepted the cruelty of her circumstance with a stoicism that made Thorne feel small and cowardly. "Let's move," Miller barked, shouldering his rifle and kicking the door open. The squad filed out one by one, stepping into the biting cold of the evening. None of them looked back at the woman sitting alone in the dark room. They were focused on the tree line, on their own survival, on the long march back to Union lines. Thorn was the last to leave. He paused in the doorway, his hand on the frame, looking back at the silhouette of the woman who had saved their lives. "She's useless now," he heard Higgins mutter to another soldier as they crossed the yard, the words carried on the wind. The casual cruelty of the statement struck Thorn like a physical blow. It wasn't just that they were leaving her, it was that they had already dehumanized her to make the leaving easier. They had turned her from a savior into an object, a piece of debris in the path of their retreat. Thorn clenched his jaw until his teeth ached, forced himself to turn around, and stepped into the night. The march into the forest was grueling. The ground was frozen hard, covered in a layer of frost that crunched loudly under their boots, making stealth difficult. Every snap of a twig sounded like a gunshot. Thorn took point, leading his men up the steep incline of the ridge, moving away from the farmhouse and the village below. But his mind was not on the path ahead. It was back in that parlor, in the darkness, with the blind woman waiting for the inevitable arrival of the enemy. As they reached the crest of the first hill, a mile away from the farm, a glow began to rise behind them. It started as a faint orange flicker, barely visible through the dense pine trees, but it quickly grew in intensity, painting the underbelly of the clouds in shades of angry violet and red. The smell of smoke reached them moments later, thick and acrid. Thorn stopped. He didn't need binoculars to know what it was. The farmhouse was burning. The squad halted, watching the glow in silence. "They're there," Miller said quietly. "We got out just in time." There was relief in his voice, a selfish, human relief. But Thorn felt a coldness spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the weather. He looked at the fire, imagining Elara in her chair, the heat rising, the smoke filling her lungs, the useless woman, the debt unpaid, the honor abandoned in the mud. Thorn turned to Miller. "Take the squad to the rally point at Blue Creek," he ordered, his voice terrifyingly calm. He unslung his pack and dropped it on the frozen ground. "Give the intel to the major." Miller stared at him, eyes wide. "Captain, what are you doing? You can't go back down there. It's a whole company of Rebs." Thorn checked the percussion caps on his revolver and tightened his belt. "I'm not asking you to come, Sergeant. I'm giving you an order. Move out." Without waiting for a response, Captain Thorn turned his back on safety and began the descent back toward the fire. The descent was far more treacherous than the climb. Thorn moved not with the caution of a soldier, but with the reckless determination of a man who has already accepted his own death. The forest around him was a tapestry of shadows and jagged shapes, illuminated sporadically by the flickering light of the burning village below. The wind howled through the ravine, carrying the sounds of shouting, the whinnying of horses, and the distinct popping crackle of dry timber being consumed by flames. Every step he took away from his squad was a step away from logic, away from the military protocol that had defined his life for the last 3 years. Inside his mind, a war raged that was just as violent as the one tearing the country apart. Part of him, the rational officer, screamed that this was suicide. He was one man with a 6-shooter and a saber walking into a nest of vipers. What could he possibly achieve? If Elara was already dead, his return was a hollow gesture. If she was alive, he couldn't possibly carry her out alone amidst an enemy encampment. But the other part of him, the part that had listened to her pray in the quiet hours of the night, knew that walking away was a spiritual death far worse than a physical one. He reached the edge of the tree line and crouched behind a fallen oak log, scanning the scene before him. The farmhouse was fully engulfed now, the roof collapsing inward with a shower of sparks that spiraled up into the night sky like fireflies. Silhouetted against the inferno were dozens of figures, Confederate irregulars. They were looting the outbuildings, dragging sacks of grain and livestock into the yard. They laughed and drank from jug handles, celebrating their small victory over a defenseless homestead. It was a scene of chaotic gluttony, the ugly underbelly of a war that had dragged on too long. Thorn crept closer, using the smoke as cover. The acrid fumes stung his eyes and burned his throat, but they also masked his scent and softened his silhouette. He moved through the ruined vegetable garden, stepping over frozen pumpkins and shattered fence posts. He needed to know. He needed to see a body or confirm she was gone. He circled the burning main house, heat radiating against his face, blistering his skin. The front door was gone, consumed by fire. There was no way anyone was alive inside that structure. Then he heard it. A sound so faint he almost dismissed it as the wind, a whimpering, not from the house, but from the barn, the only structure not yet set ablaze. Thorn froze. He watched the barn door. 2 Confederate sentries stood near it, smoking pipes, their rifles leaning casually against the wood. They were relaxed, confident in their total control of the area. They had no reason to suspect that a lone Union officer was lying in the mud less than 30 yards away. Thorn's grip on his revolver tightened until the metal bit into his palm. If she was in the barn, she was being held. And if she was being held by men like this, after they had burned her home, the reality of her situation was likely a nightmare. The conflict within him shifted. It was no longer about saving her life. The odds of that were microscopic. It was about witnessing. It was about the fact that she was not just useless debris. She was a human being who was terrified and alone because he had ordered his men to walk away. He needed a distraction. Thorn looked around and spotted the dry brush piled up near the horse corral. If he could ignite that, the wind would push the smoke right into the sentries' faces. He crawled on his belly, the frozen mud soaking through his trousers, numbing his legs. He moved with agonizing slowness, timing his movements with the bursts of laughter from the looters. When he reached the brush, he struck a lucifer match, shielding the tiny flame with his body, and touched it to the dry leaves. The fire caught instantly, eager and hungry. Thorn rolled away, retreating back into the shadows of a tool shed. As the brush flared up, the horses in the corral panicked, kicking and whinnying. The sentries by the barn shouted, distracted, and ran toward the corral to secure the animals. It was a small window, barely 10 seconds. Thorn didn't hesitate. He sprinted across the open ground, a shadow moving within shadows, and slipped through the slightly ajar door of the barn. The inside of the barn was dark, lit only by the slivers of firelight coming through the cracks in the walls. The air smelled of hay and manure. Thorn stood still, letting his eyes adjust, listening over the pounding of his own heart. "Ilara," he whispered, the sound barely audible. There was a rustle in the far corner, near the horse stalls. A low groan. It was the sound of someone in immense pain, someone trying to stifle a scream. He moved toward the sound, stepping carefully to avoid straw that might crunch. When he reached the stall, he knelt down. What he found made his blood run cold, freezing the very marrow of his bones. Ilara was there, slumped against the wooden partition. She was alive, but barely. Her face was bruised, her clothes torn. But it was the blood pooling in her lap that tore the breath from Thorn's lungs. They hadn't just beaten her, they had tortured her. "Captain," she wheezed, her voice wet and gurgling. She sensed his presence, her blind head turning unerringly toward him. "You came back." It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of disbelief. Thorn reached out and touched her shoulder, his hand trembling uncontrollably. The sheer magnitude of the violence visited upon this frail, blind woman shattered whatever professional detachment he had left. The conflict was over. The soldier was gone. Only the man remained, and the man was filled with a cold, black rage. "I'm here, Ilara," he choked out. "I'm here." He looked at her injuries, a deep bayonet wound in her side. It was fatal. She was bleeding out. There was no saving her, no medical miracle that could reverse this. She had been left to die slowly in the cold while they looted her farm. The useless woman had paid the price for their safety. Thorn felt a tear trace a hot path through the soot on his cheek. The realization hit him. Mercy was no longer an option, not for him, and certainly not for them. Ilara died 3 minutes later. She died holding Thorn's hand, her breathing slowing until it simply stopped, leaving a silence in the barn that was heavier than the war itself. Thorn did not move for a long time. He knelt there in the dark, the sounds of the enemy celebration outside filtering through the wood, drunken cheers, the smashing of glass, a fiddle playing a disjointed, mocking tune. Something inside Thorn broke. It wasn't a loud crack, but a silent disintegration of the moral boundaries that separated a soldier from a butcher. He gently laid Ilara's hand on her chest. He closed her sightless eyes, though they were already staring into an eternity he could not see. He stood up, and the world seemed to sharpen. The fatigue that had plagued him for days vanished, replaced by a surge of adrenaline that felt electric. He checked his revolver. 5 shots. He had his saber. He had a knife in his boot. There were at least 20 men outside. The math was impossible, but Thorn didn't care about the math anymore. He cared about the balance. He moved to the barn door and peered out. The fire from the house was dying down, casting long, dancing shadows across the yard. The Confederates had settled in, confident in their security. A group of 4 men sat around a campfire near the well, laughing. One of them was wearing Ilara's shawl, a hand-knitted wool wrap she used to keep warm. Seeing that piece of fabric on the shoulders of a laughing killer was the spark that ignited Thorn's powder keg. Thorn didn't scream. He didn't charge in with a battle cry. He stepped out of the barn with the quiet lethality of a ghost. He approached the nearest sentry, a young boy barely 18, who was leaning against a wagon wheel, half asleep. Thorn grabbed him from behind, one hand clamping over his mouth, the other driving his knife between the boy's ribs. The boy stiffened, gasped into Thorn's glove, and went limp. Thorn lowered him to the ground gently. 1. He moved toward the campfire. The men were drunk, their rifles scattered on the ground. They didn't hear him until he was 5 feet away. Thorn raised his revolver. Bang! The man wearing the shawl fell backward, a hole in his forehead. Bang! The second man took a round to the throat before he could stand. The other 2 scrambled for their weapons, panic erupting in their eyes. Thorn didn't stop. He fired again, missing the 3rd man, but hitting the 4th in the shoulder. The camp erupted. Shouts of alarm rang out. "Yankees, attack!" someone screamed, but there was no army. There was just Thorn. He holstered the empty revolver and drew his saber, the steel flashing orange in the firelight. The 3rd man at the fire lunged at him with a bayonet. Thorn sidestepped, parried the thrust with a metallic clang, and slashed his blade across the man's stomach. The Confederate fell, screaming. Bullets began to whiz past him, kicking up spurts of dirt and ash. Thorn didn't seek cover. He advanced. He was a demon in the smoke, a figure of vengeance that seemed impervious to fear. He moved toward the officer's tent, knowing that was where the command lay. A large, bearded man emerged, trying to button his tunic, a pistol in his hand. This was the leader. This was the man responsible. Thorn charged. The Confederate officer fired, the bullet grazing Thorn's left arm, spinning him around. The pain was white-hot, but Thorn used the momentum to swing his saber in a wide arc. The officer tried to duck, but he was too slow. The blade bit deep into his shoulder, and they both went down in a tangle of limbs and mud. They rolled on the frozen ground, grunting, struggling for dominance. Thorn dropped his sword and punched the officer in the face, feeling cartilage crack. He punched him again and again, venting all the frustration, the guilt, the self-hatred into the man's face. "She was blind!" Thorn roared, the first words he had spoken since the shooting started. "She was helpless!" The officer tried to reach for his dropped pistol, but Thorn pinned his arm with his knee. Suddenly, a blow to the back of his head sent Thorn reeling. Another soldier had arrived, slamming a rifle butt into his skull. Thorn collapsed, his vision swimming. He tasted blood and dirt. He tried to rise, but a boot kicked him hard in the ribs, flipping him over. He looked up to see 3 Confederates standing over him, bayonets leveled. He was surrounded. He was beaten. But as he looked at the burning house and the dead men around the fire, he didn't feel defeat. He felt a grim satisfaction. He had made them pay. "Don't kill him yet," a voice growled. It was a sergeant, looking at the devastation Thorn had caused. "I want to know where the rest of them are." Thorn spat a mouthful of blood onto the sergeant's boot. He smiled, a gruesome, bloody expression. "There is no one else," he rasped. "Just me and her." He nodded toward the barn. The confusion on the soldiers' faces was palpable. They couldn't understand. They couldn't comprehend that one man would come back into the jaws of death for a useless old woman. The beating that followed was systematic and brutal. They dragged Thorn to the center of the yard, stripping him of his coat and boots, leaving him shivering in the freezing mud. They wanted intel. They wanted to know the troop movements, the numbers, the location of the main force. But Thorn gave them nothing. Every blow they landed only solidified his silence. He had already completed his mission. His mission wasn't military anymore. It was spiritual. Eventually, the Confederates tired of the sport. The enemy sergeant, realizing the prisoner would not talk and that the commotion might attract a larger Union force, ordered his men to pack up. They were spooked. The ferocity of the one-man assault had shaken them. They believed he was the vanguard of a larger attack. They decided to execute him and retreat before dawn. The sergeant pulled his pistol, aiming it at Thorn's head. "Wait!" the Confederate officer groaned, clutching his shattered shoulder. He looked at Thorn with a mixture of hatred and grudging respect. "Leave him. He's gutted. He'll freeze to death before the sun comes up. Let the crows have him. We move out. Now." It was a final act of cruelty, to deny him a quick death. The Confederates gathered their wounded, took what loot they could carry, and melted back into the darkness of the woods, leaving the burning village behind. Thorn lay alone in the mud. His body was broken. He couldn't feel his legs. His vision was tunneling, the edges turning grey. The cold was seeping into his core, slowing his heart. It would be easy to close his eyes and drift away. It would be peaceful. But he had one last thing to do. He couldn't die like this. Not yet. He gritted his teeth and forced his body to move. He dragged himself by his elbows, inch by agonizing inch, toward the barn. The journey of 30 yards took an hour. He left a trail of blood in the frost behind him. He passed the bodies of the men he had killed, their eyes open to the indifferent stars. He felt no remorse for them. He reached the barn door and collapsed, panting, his breath misting in the freezing air. He had to get to her. He had to finish it. He crawled into the stall where Ilara lay. The silence was absolute. He pulled himself up until he was sitting beside her body. He was lightheaded, his thoughts drifting. He remembered his wife back in Ohio. He remembered the day he enlisted. He remembered the way the sun looked on the wheat fields, but mostly he remembered Ilara's prayer, "I will be here when it ends." Thorn reached into his pocket with numb, clumsy fingers. He pulled out his rank insignia, the captain's bars he had worked so hard to earn, the symbol of his authority, his career, his identity. He looked at the tarnished brass in the dim light. It meant nothing now. The rank had been a lie. The only rank that mattered was the one he had earned tonight. He reached out and took Ilara's cold hands, folding them gently over her chest. He placed the insignia on top of her hands, pressing the metal against her skin. It was a medal, a citation for bravery, a silent apology. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice failing. "I'm so sorry." He leaned his head back against the wooden stall, the adrenaline finally fading, leaving him hollow. The pain began to recede, replaced by a strange warmth. He watched the light from the dying fire flicker through the cracks in the barn wall. It was beautiful, in a way. The war seemed very far away. The sounds of artillery were just distant thunder. Thorn closed his eyes. He didn't feel the cold anymore. He felt a hand on his shoulder. Maybe it was Miller, maybe it was Ilara, maybe it was God. He didn't know. And then he didn't know anything at all. The morning sun broke over the smoky mountains with a brilliance that mocked the carnage below. The light touched the ruins of the farmhouse, now just a smouldering foundation of black timber and ash. The frost on the ground glittered like diamonds, indifferent to the blood frozen within it. The silence of the valley was broken only by the cawing of crows circling the yard, waiting for their turn. A Confederate scouting patrol, a different unit from the night before, approached the village cautiously. They were led by a young lieutenant on a grey mare. They had seen the smoke and heard the reports of a skirmish. They rode into the yard, their horses stepping nervously around the bodies of the bushwhackers scattered near the campfire. The lieutenant dismounted, his boots crunching on the bloody frost. He looked at the dead men, Confederates. "Who did this?" he muttered to his sergeant. "Must have been a whole platoon of Yanks." They swept the area, weapons drawn. They found no Union soldiers, no tracks of a retreating army, just the chaotic aftermath of a brawl. The lieutenant walked toward the barn, the only structure still standing. He pushed the door open with the barrel of his rifle, the hinges creaking loudly in the morning air. A shaft of sunlight pierced the gloom, illuminating the interior. The lieutenant stopped, his breath catching in his throat. He lowered his rifle slowly. "Dear God," he whispered. In the horse stall, sitting side by side, were the bodies of an old woman and a man in a tattered blue uniform. The man was slumped against the wall, his head resting near the woman's shoulder, as if he were guarding her even in death. The lieutenant stepped closer, drawn by something glittering on the woman's hands. He knelt down, removing his hat out of instinctive respect. There, resting on the folded, gnarled hands of the blind civilian, were the tarnished brass bars of a Union captain. The insignia had been placed with such care, such deliberate reverence, that it silenced the soldiers standing behind him. "He came back," the sergeant said, his voice hushed. "This Yankee, he came back for her." The realization rippled through the patrol. They looked at the dead captain, then at the bodies of the looters outside. The story told itself. It wasn't a military operation. It wasn't a strategic assault. It was a man throwing his life away for honor. It was a testament to a code that went deeper than uniforms or flags. The lieutenant stood up, his face grim. "Bury them," he ordered. "Together. Here." The sergeant looked at him, surprised. "The Yankee too, sir." The lieutenant nodded, looking down at Thorne's peaceful face. "He earned it, more than any of us have today." He looked at the insignia one last time, then turned away. "Leave the rank on her. It belongs to her now." Miles away at the Union rally point, Sergeant Miller stood by the edge of the camp, scanning the tree line with binoculars. He'd been standing there since dawn. The rest of the squad was eating breakfast, trying to ignore the empty space where their captain should have been. Higgins walked up to Miller, holding a tin cup of coffee. "He's not coming, Sarge," Higgins said softly. "You know he's not." Miller lowered the binoculars. His eyes were red-rimmed and hollow. He knew. He had known the moment Thorne turned back. He looked at the smoke still rising faintly in the distance. "He didn't want to come back," Miller said, his voice heavy with a shame that would follow him for the rest of his life. "He went to fix what we broke." Miller turned back to the squad. "Pack up," he ordered, his voice harsh to hide the tremor. "We move in 10. As the men scrambled to obey, Miller took one last look at the distant ridge. He saluted, a sharp, crisp motion directed at the empty forest. It was a meaningless gesture, unseen and unacknowledged, but it was all he had left. The war would go on. They would fight and march and kill, but they would never be the same. They had survived, but they had left their souls in that burning village, guarded forever by the captain, who didn't look back.